My name is Sarah Miller, and for most of my life, I believed that family should be a place of safety. That belief was shattered the day my own sister tried to kill me while my mother stood on the shore and told me I was being dramatic. It was supposed to be a normal summer afternoon at Lake Haven. The Miller family always spent one weekend in July together by the water. It was meant to look like tradition, a way of showing our neighbors and relatives that we were a tight-knit family who enjoyed each other's company. In truth, it was a stage where my mother Linda and my sister Emily played their roles as the perfect mother and the golden child, while I was cast as the problem, the one who never fit the picture. The sun was high that afternoon. The lake shimmered like a sheet of glass broken only by the ripples of children splashing near the dock. I stood at the edge hesitant. I had never liked deep water. I had learned early that fear was a weakness in my family, and my sister knew exactly how to use it against me. Emily was laughing with some cousins, her blonde hair catching the light like something out of a magazine. When she turned to me, her smile had an edge that only I could see. "Come on, Sarah, don't just stand there like a statue. Get in," she teased loudly, making sure everyone heard. A few of our relatives chuckled, nodding at her boldness. My cheeks burned. I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Maybe later," I said softly. But Emily thrived on spectacle. She closed the distance between us, her voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. "You always ruin everything. Maybe you need a little push." Before I could respond, her hands slammed into my back. The force was sudden and merciless. My feet left the wooden dock, and in an instant I was in the air. The world tilted. Then the lake swallowed me whole. Cold water closed around me like a fist. My body plunged deep, disoriented, spinning. For a second, I did not know which way was up. Panic surged through me, my lungs screaming for air. I kicked wildly, desperate to reach the surface. When I broke through the water gasping, I saw Emily standing above me on the dock. Her smile was gone, replaced with a blank expression, as if she had not done anything at all. My arms thrashed, trying to stay afloat. "Help!" I sputtered, coughing, as water rushed into my mouth. I looked toward my mother standing calmly a few feet away on the dock, her sundress swaying in the breeze. For one fragile moment, I thought she would leap into action, that she would finally be the mother who saved me. Instead, she pressed her hand against her hip, her eyes cold and detached. "Stop being dramatic, Sarah," she said in a voice that carried across the water. My heart clenched. She did not move closer. She did not bend down to reach for me. She simply dismissed my terror as though I were performing for attention. Around us, a few relatives shifted uncomfortably, but no one jumped in. No one wanted to cross Linda Miller. The water dragged at my clothes, heavy and suffocating. Every gulp of air came with another mouthful of lake water. My chest burned. I tried to cry out again, but only a strangled gurgle escaped. Emily crouched down near the dock's edge and tilted her head. Her lips curved into a smile that was too small for anyone else to notice. It was a smile meant only for me, a signal that she knew she held my life in her hands, and that no one would believe me if I accused her. I clawed toward the side of the dock, fingers slipping on the algae-covered wood. My vision blurred at the edges. The sound of children laughing nearby felt distant, muffled, as if I were already sinking into another world. My body screamed to give up, to surrender to the water pressing into my lungs. But some stubborn part of me refused. My nails scraped against a root that jutted out from the shore. I clung to it with every shred of strength I had left. Inch by inch, coughing and heaving, I dragged myself toward the shallows. When I finally collapsed on the muddy bank, my chest convulsed in painful spasms as I vomited lake water. My limbs trembled uncontrollably. I looked up, hoping for comfort, but saw only the figure of my mother towering above me. Her lips pursed in irritation, not concern. "Honestly, Sarah, you always make such a scene," she muttered. Emily knelt beside her, pretending to look worried, but her eyes glinted with triumph. As I lay there gasping for air, my skin raw and my throat burning, the truth settled into me heavier than the water that had filled my lungs. My sister had just tried to drown me, and my mother had stood by not only watching, but silencing me with a single cruel sentence. Their silence was not ignorance. It was complicity. At that moment, with the taste of lake water still sharp in my mouth, I realized that I was alone in a family that had chosen my destruction over my survival. And yet, even in my weakest breath, a thought began to form. If I survived this, I would never let their lies bury my truth again. When I staggered back to the cabin after the incident at the lake, my body was still trembling from the shock of nearly drowning. My clothes clung to my skin, dripping water onto the wooden floorboards as I entered. I expected at least a blanket, maybe a cup of tea, some gesture of care from my mother. Instead, Linda looked up from her chair with a sigh of exasperation, as if I had embarrassed her in front of the family. "For heaven's sake, Sarah, dry yourself before you ruin the floor," she said sharply, ignoring the tears streaming down my face. Emily stood nearby, her voice dripping with false concern. "I told her not to run on the dock, Mom. She just never listens." My breath caught in my chest. "That's not true." "You pushed me," I whispered, but my words sounded fragile in the heavy silence. Linda's gaze hardened cold and flat. "Do not accuse your sister of things you know you made up. You fell in because you are careless." Her tone was final, a verdict delivered before I could defend myself. A couple of relatives sat stiffly on the couch, avoiding my eyes. They did not want to be involved. Their silence was louder than any shout. I tried again, desperation giving me strength. She shoved me. I almost drowned. "You saw it." My mother's lips curved into a bitter smile. "You always exaggerate, Sarah. Always. You want attention, but this is not how you get it." Emily pressed her hand to her mouth as though stifling tears, a perfect performance for our audience. "I tried to help her, Mom. She just keeps blaming me for everything." The weight of betrayal pressed down on me. I stood there dripping, shaking, still tasting lake water in my throat, and they were rewriting the story in front of my eyes. The room smelled faintly of grilled corn and sunscreen from the afternoon barbecue, but beneath it was the stench of deceit. My cousin glanced at me for a second, pity flickering across her face, but she quickly looked away. She would not challenge Linda either. I felt as if I were suffocating all over again, not with water this time, but with lies. I backed away toward the hallway, needing to escape their eyes. My chest still hurt, every breath ragged, but the sting of my mother's words cut deeper than the lake ever could. In the bathroom, I clutched the sink and stared at my reflection. My hair was plastered to my forehead, my eyes red and wild. For a fleeting second, I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was dramatic. Maybe I had imagined the malice in Emily's smile. But the bruises blooming on my arms where she had shoved me told another story. The soreness in my throat from swallowing water was undeniable. No, I had not imagined it. I had survived it, and now they were erasing it. At dinner that evening, my father David finally joined us, having returned from work. He glanced at my pale face and asked casually, "What happened to you?" Before I could answer, Linda's voice cut in smoothly. "Sarah slipped into the lake. She frightened everyone with her drama, but she is fine now." Emily chimed in with a giggle. "She made it look like she was drowning Dad, but it was not that bad." David looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly, but then he shrugged and returned to his plate. "Try to be more careful, Sarah," he muttered, as if that closed the matter. My hands trembled as I tried to eat the taste of food turning to ash in my mouth. They had all agreed on the narrative without me. It was 3 against 1, a script rehearsed long before I opened my mouth. Every time I looked up, Emily's smug expression reminded me of what had really happened. She had tried to drown me, and they had applauded her performance by pretending nothing had happened. My voice was gone strangled by their version of reality. Yet deep inside, a seed of resistance took root. Their silence had nearly killed me, but it had also revealed their weakness. They needed me quiet to maintain control. If I ever found the courage to gather proof to break their walls of lies, they would not be able to stop me. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the chirping of crickets outside the cabin, I pressed my bruised arms against my chest and swore silently to myself. One day, the truth would be louder than their denials. One day, their gaslighting would collapse under the weight of evidence. For now, I endured their story, but I began to plot my own. Growing up in the Miller household meant living in a world where silence was both a shield and a prison. My earliest memories are not of laughter or warmth, but of the way the air shifted when my mother Linda entered the room. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floor like a countdown to judgment, and my sister Emily always seemed to know exactly how to perform to earn praise. I, on the other hand, was the designated scapegoat. I learned early that my existence was inconvenient. I was 6 when I first realized that favoritism was not just a feeling, but a system. One Saturday morning, I spilled orange juice on the kitchen table. My heart raced as Linda's face darkened. "Sarah, you are hopeless," she snapped, slapping the glass away. Emily, only a year older, chimed in sweetly. "I will clean it up." "Mom?" And Linda's expression softened instantly. She kissed Emily on the forehead and said, "You are such a good girl." I stood frozen, stung not only by the sharpness of my mother's words, but also by how effortlessly Emily turned my mistake into her triumph. That set the pattern for years to come. Whenever I tried to speak, Emily spoke louder. Whenever I tried to prove myself, she found a way to turn my effort into a mockery. Linda fed that dynamic, praising Emily as the golden child and reducing me to the role of the difficult daughter. My father, David, though present physically, rarely intervened. He would sit at the head of the table reading the newspaper while chaos unfolded. His silence was his allegiance to my mother. If she called me dramatic, he nodded. If she said I was clumsy, he shrugged. I was the problem child because that was easier for him to accept than challenging Linda's authority. By the time I was 10, Emily had mastered cruelty disguised as play. She would hide my homework and then watch as Linda scolded me for being irresponsible. She would whisper secrets into my friends' ears, turning them against me, then smile sweetly when confronted. The worst was the day she shoved me down the staircase. I remember the sickening thud of my arm against the steps, the way my vision blurred as I hit the floor. Pain seared through me, and my screams echoed in the hallway. Linda rushed in, saw Emily standing at the top, and without hesitation declared, "She tripped. She needs to be more careful." Emily nodded solemnly as though she agreed, but the corners of her lips twitched upward. At the hospital, Linda told the doctor I was clumsy and prone to accidents. I listened in silence as the words carved my identity into something untrue, something that followed me for years. School was my only refuge. Teachers called me bright, hardworking, creative. They saw in me what my family refused to acknowledge. I clung to their words like life rafts, but even there, Emily managed to overshadow me. She joined the choir, and my mother attended every performance with flowers in hand. When I received an award for writing, Linda barely glanced at the certificate before tossing it on the counter. "Emily sings beautifully." "That will take her far," she said, dismissing my accomplishment with a flick of her hand. As adolescence arrived, the gulf between us widened. Emily became the golden girl of our small community, invited to parties, admired by adults for her poise. I was labeled the quiet, awkward one. Linda encouraged that image, often reminding people how Sarah exaggerates things, or Sarah has always been a little dramatic. I began to doubt myself, wondering if maybe she was right. Each punishment reinforced it. When I protested unfairness, Linda's hand struck my cheek with a sting that lingered long after the red mark faded. When I cried, Emily rolled her eyes and called me manipulative. I retreated inward, learning to carry my pain silently. But silence is heavy and it builds. By 15, I had perfected the art of appearing fine. I smiled when expected, lowered my head when scolded, and played the part of the broken daughter. Inside, though, anger smoldered. I kept a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard, documenting every slap, every shove, every cruel word. Those pages became the only place where my truth lived. Looking back, I see how calculated the control was. Linda knew exactly when to cut me down to keep Emily elevated. Emily knew exactly how to provoke me in ways that looked harmless to outsiders. The two of them formed an alliance of power, one that fed off my isolation. My father remained in the background, his silence complicit. He called it keeping the peace, but peace built on denial is not peace at all. It is surrender. One Christmas stands out vividly. Emily received a necklace she had wanted for months, a delicate chain with a sparkling charm. I unwrapped a sweater 2 sizes too big. "You can grow into it," Linda said with a smirk. When I tried to hide my disappointment, Emily leaned over and whispered, "You will never be enough, Sarah." The words burned more than the slap that followed when I dared to answer back. I realized then that the hierarchy of our family was fixed and I was cemented at the bottom. Still, fragments of resistance lived inside me. I studied harder than ever, pouring myself into academics, desperate to carve out an identity they could not erase. Teachers encouraged me, and for a while, I believed that leaving for college might free me. But even in those moments of hope, Emily and Linda pulled me back down with reminders of who they said I was. "You will not last on your own," Linda would warn. "Sarah cannot handle real life," Emily added with a laugh. Their voices became a chorus in my head louder than my own. And yet deep within another voice whispered that they were wrong, that I was not dramatic or weak, that I was surviving against all odds. When Emily pushed me into the lake years later, it was not an isolated act of cruelty, but the culmination of a lifetime of control. Every bruise, every insult, every denial led to that moment. And as the water filled my lungs, I realized that if I did not fight to expose the truth, I would drown not only in the lake, but in their lies forever. That flashback reminds me that the attempt on my life at the lake was not sudden, it was rehearsed through years of conditioning. My childhood was the script, and the shove into the water was the climax of their play. But unlike before, I was no longer a child forced into silence. I was a woman ready to gather every memory, every scar, every word into a weapon of truth. After the lake incident, life in the Miller household tightened like a noose around my throat. The moment I tried to speak about what had really happened, Emily and Linda rushed to weave their story louder and faster than mine. At church the following Sunday, Linda leaned over to Mrs. Jacobs, one of the most respected women in town, and said with a shake of her head, "Sarah has always been a bit dramatic. She slipped into the lake last week and nearly scared us all to death, thrashing like she was drowning." Mrs. Jacobs looked at me with mild pity, and Emily added, "I tried to help her, but she just panicked." Their words hung in the air, cementing the narrative before I could open my mouth. It became clear that they had a strategy: erase my truth, replace it with theirs, and do it in public so that I was discredited before I even spoke. At home, Linda scolded me in private, her voice sharp as a blade. "Do not embarrass this family with your stories. Do you hear me, Sarah? You will destroy us with your lies." I stared at her, still nursing the bruises on my arms from Emily's shove, but she dismissed them as nothing. Emily smirked from across the room, victorious once again. Their silence and denial after the fall down the stairs years ago had trained them well. Now they had perfected the art of collective gaslighting, where their voices drowned out mine until I doubted my own memory. But this time was different. The terror of sinking beneath the water had awakened something inside me, a refusal to be silenced forever. I began writing everything down in more detail than ever before. Every cruel remark, every fabricated story they spread, every bruise I concealed. I purchased a small tape recorder with money from my part-time job at the local diner. I kept it hidden beneath my mattress, ready to capture their voices when they slipped, because I knew they would slip. And they did. One evening, Emily cornered me in the kitchen, her face twisted with disdain. "Next time I will make sure you do not come back up," she hissed. My heart pounded, but I held my ground, forcing my face into blankness so she would not see fear. The tape recorder in my pocket hummed quietly, capturing every venomous word. Linda walked in moments later, and instead of scolding Emily, she glared at me. "If you provoke her again, Sarah, I will not protect you. Learn your place." My hand pressed against my side, feeling the outline of the recorder, knowing I had proof. But proof alone would not be enough. They were skilled liars, pillars of the community, and I was just the daughter already labeled dramatic. I needed more, so I waited. Each day the tension grew thicker. Relatives came to visit, and Linda repeated her version with slight variations. Sarah fell. "She always has trouble with balance." Emily performed concerned sighing that she wished I would take better care of myself. Even David, my father, echoed their lines, repeating them absent-mindedly as though they were fact. My chest tightened whenever I heard my life reduced to a clumsy accident. It was suffocating to live under their script, but it also sharpened my resolve. One night during dinner, Emily deliberately knocked over a glass of water into my lap. I gasped, standing quickly, but before I could speak, Linda snapped, "Sit down, Sarah. No more dramatics." My father sighed heavily, muttering, "You are always starting something." My throat burned with swallowed words. I sat drenched and humiliated, but I pressed record beneath the table, catching every dismissive phrase. It was fuel. They thought they were breaking me, but they were feeding the evidence I needed. In the weeks that followed, Linda escalated her tactics. She told the neighbors I was unstable, suggesting I had inherited some imaginary illness from a distant relative. She hinted to my teachers that I fabricated stories for attention. Emily whispered to classmates that I was dangerous to be around. Soon, the whispers followed me everywhere. People looked at me with suspicion as though I might lash out or invent tales at any moment. Isolation grew like vines around me, but I clung to my recordings and journals, building a case in secret. I knew the day would come when their lies would collide with undeniable truth. The moment arrived when Emily shoved me in the kitchen, my head slamming against the edge of the counter. Stars exploded in my vision, pain ripping through my skull. Linda rushed in, her first words not of concern, but accusation. "What did you do to provoke her?" "Sarah." I crumpled to the floor, the world-spinning nausea rolling through me. David drove me to the hospital reluctantly after I vomited on the kitchen tiles. In the sterile light of the emergency room, Linda explained smoothly to the nurse. She fainted. "She has always been dramatic." Emily nodded in agreement, eyes wide with fake worry. I wanted to scream the truth, but the dizziness pinned me down. The doctor ordered a CT scan, his brow furrowed. "Her symptoms are not consistent with a fainting spell," he said. Linda tried to protest, but his tone silenced her. The images revealed trauma, a small fracture evidence of repeated head injuries. His words were careful but firm. "This is not the result of a simple fall. This is consistent with external force." Linda paled. Emily shifted uncomfortably, and David muttered something about clumsiness, but the doctor's eyes told me he knew. My heart raced with both fear and vindication. Finally, after years of silence and lies, I had something they could not easily twist. For the first time, the narrative slipped out of their hands. The day the doctor showed me the CT scan results felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified of the drop, but finally seeing a rope hanging within reach. I sat on the hospital bed, the sterile scent of disinfectant stinging my nose, my head pounding in waves. My mother, Linda, perched stiffly in the chair across from me, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Emily paced near the window, pretending to be anxious. David hovered at the doorway, uninterested, glancing at his phone, as though he had more important matters than his injured daughter. The doctor, a calm man with sharp eyes named Dr. Andrews, unfolded the film and held it to the light. "Sarah," he said firmly, "this scan shows trauma. It is not consistent with fainting or clumsiness. These injuries required force." The room seemed to freeze. Linda let out a sharp laugh, brittle and unconvincing. "Oh, Dr. Sarah has always been dramatic. She trips, she bumps into things, she makes everything worse than it is." Emily nodded quickly, adding in a soft voice, "She exaggerates, Doctor. She likes attention." But Dr. Andrews did not flinch. He tapped the film again. "I have seen this before. The pattern is clear. Repeated trauma, not an accident." His words filled the room like thunder. My chest swelled with a mixture of fear and vindication. For so long I had begged to be heard, and now someone finally confirmed what I had always known. Still, my family did not yield. Linda leaned closer to the doctor, her tone dripping with disdain. "You do not know Sarah like we do. She tells stories. She always has." Emily placed a hand on her heart as if wounded. "I tried to help her. She blames me for everything." David finally spoke, his voice low. "Sarah needs discipline, not pity. She should not waste your time." Their words stabbed at me, but for once they did not land. Dr. Andrews looked directly at me, bypassing them entirely. "Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. You did not do this to yourself." My throat tightened. Tears welled in my eyes, not from pain, but from relief. He saw me. He believed me, and his authority meant their lies could no longer dominate unchallenged. When Linda realized she could not sway him, her face twisted with fury. She turned to me, her voice a venomous whisper. "If you say one word outside this room, you will regret it. Do you understand?" But her threat no longer held the same power. I clutched the bed rail, my body trembling, and nodded only to keep her quiet. Inside, however, something unbreakable had been planted. That night alone in the hospital, I pressed the button to replay my hidden tape recorder. Emily's voice hissed back at me. "Next time I will make sure you do not come back up." Linda's voice followed. "If you provoke her again, I will not protect you. Proof. My proof." Combined with the CT scan, I now held more than bruises and memories. I had evidence. The next morning, a social worker named Karen entered my room. Her eyes were kind but searching. "Sarah, Dr. Andrews filed a report. He believes you may be a victim of abuse. Is that true?" My heart pounded. For years, I had rehearsed what I would say if someone finally asked me directly, but the words stuck in my throat. I pictured Linda's glare, Emily's smirk, David's sigh. Fear coiled around me. But then I remembered the water filling my lungs, the sound of my mother's voice telling me to stop being dramatic while I nearly drowned. I forced the words out, shaky but clear. "Yes, it is true." Karen nodded, not with shock, but with steady reassurance. "You are not alone anymore." Those words unraveled years of isolation. For the first time, I felt the possibility of escape. Linda and Emily visited later, their performance polished. Linda brought flowers. Emily clutched my hand with false tears, but their eyes betrayed them. I no longer cared. I stared straight ahead, refusing to play my part in their charade. When Karen re-entered with a police officer that evening, Linda's mask cracked. "This is a family matter," she snapped. "You cannot involve outsiders." But the officer's expression was firm. "Ma'am, this is not negotiable. Allegations of violence have been made, and medical evidence supports them." Emily's hand tightened on mine, nails digging into my skin. "How could you do this to us?" she hissed, her whisper sharp enough to cut. I turned to her, slowly meeting her gaze for the first time, without fear. "You did this to me." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Over the next few days, investigations began. Karen asked questions, carefully documenting every detail. I handed over my journals, my recordings, my memories carved into words. Each page was a piece of the puzzle they had tried to bury. Linda argued with administrators, demanding I be released into her care, but the hospital refused. Emily's friends began to whisper when they heard fragments of the story. The mask of perfection they had worn for years began to slip. One evening, Dr. Andrews returned to check on me. He leaned close, his voice low but unwavering. "Sarah, I will testify if needed. Your injuries cannot be explained away. The truth is on your side." Those words became my anchor. The fear had not vanished. Nights were still long filled with nightmares of drowning, of gasping for breath, of hands pushing me deeper into the dark water. But alongside the fear was something new: resolve. I was no longer the silent girl blamed for everything. I was the survivor holding the receipts, and this time their lies would not win. I realized then that the lake had not only almost killed me, it had also forced me to see that silence was no longer an option. The evidence was my lifeline, and I would use it to drag myself fully out of their grasp. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself resisted being breathed. I was wheeled into the courthouse, still weak from the concussion, my body frail but my determination carved sharp inside me. The polished wood floors gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, echoing with footsteps as people filed into the gallery. I could feel their eyes on me, some curious, some doubtful, some whispering that perhaps Sarah Miller was finally seeking attention again. Across the room, Emily sat beside Linda, their clothes immaculate, their posture rigid with confidence. Linda whispered fiercely in Emily's ear, no doubt rehearsing the lines of their performance. David sat behind them, flipping through his phone, as though the whole affair was a tedious inconvenience. When the judge entered, the chatter ceased. The proceedings began with my family's lawyer painting me as unstable, a daughter prone to exaggerations, a young woman who had invented stories before. He cited Linda's claims, Emily's insistence, David's silence, weaving them into a narrative that I was the problem child who had spun an accident into abuse. Each word tightened the knot of fear in my chest. The gallery murmured, some nodding, some shaking their heads. But when it was our turn, my attorney rose and called Dr. Andrews to the stand. He placed the CT scans on a screen, and the silence deepened. He explained with clinical precision the nature of my injuries, the fracture, the swelling, the clear pattern of repeated trauma. His voice did not waver, and the images glowed undeniable behind him. "This is not clumsiness," he said firmly. "This is blunt force trauma." Emily shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Linda's face flushed crimson as she leaned toward David, whispering furiously, but even he looked unsettled now. The judge listened intently, her gaze sharp as she took notes. My heart pounded with a mix of dread and hope. For once, the truth was not locked in my journals or trapped in my throat. It was projected in front of everyone, undeniable. When my attorney asked if I was ready to testify, my body trembled, but I rose. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I spoke of the lake of Emily's hands shoving me into the water, of Linda's voice dismissing me as dramatic while I nearly drowned. I described the kitchen incident, the shove that split my head open, the years of silence that framed every act of cruelty. As I spoke, I saw faces in the crowd shift. Some widened their eyes in horror, others frowned in recognition. The gallery was beginning to see me not as dramatic Sarah, but as a survivor. Emily could not contain herself. "She is lying," she hissed loudly, her voice breaking. "She always lies." Linda placed a restraining hand on her arm, but the damage was done. The judge's gaze hardened. When my attorney played the tape recording, the room gasped. Emily's voice filled the air, cold and sharp. "Next time I will make sure you do not come back up." Then Linda's voice followed. "If you provoke her again, I will not protect you." The weight of their own words crushed them where they sat. Emily buried her face in her hands. Linda paled. David finally lifted his eyes from his phone, his face drained of color. The judge leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "These recordings, combined with medical evidence, paint a very different picture than the one your family has presented." Murmurs rippled through the gallery, louder now, no longer in doubt but in outrage. For years they had controlled the narrative in private, but now their lies shattered under the glare of public truth. The gavel struck for recess, but the damage was irreversible. Reporters huddled near the doors, eager for the story of a mother and daughter exposed in court. Outside, whispers spread through the community. Neighbors who once saw Linda and Emily as respectable pillars now muttered words like cruel and dangerous. When the session resumed, the judge addressed my family's lawyer, her patience thin. "The evidence is strong. This court cannot ignore repeated patterns of abuse." My attorney pressed further, requesting protective measures, and the judge agreed. She ordered Emily to undergo psychological evaluation, issued a restraining order against both her and Linda, and warned David of his failure to protect. For the first time, they were cornered. Linda's shoulders slumped. Emily's tears streaked her mascara. David's jaw tightened, but his authority evaporated. I sat in my chair, still weak, but a fire surged through me. The truth had not only been spoken, it had been heard. The gallery erupted in whispers again, but this time they were whispers of support. A nurse who had cared for me smiled from the back row, nodding proudly. A neighbor shook her head in disbelief at the family she thought she knew. This was no longer a private battle, it was public justice. My family had tried to drown me in lies as surely as Emily had tried to drown me in the lake, but now they were the ones gasping for air under the weight of evidence. When the gavel struck again to close the session, the sound echoed like liberation. For the first time in my life, silence was not against me. Silence now belonged to them. After the court hearing, the ripple effects spread quickly through every corner of our lives. Emily, once the golden child adored by neighbors and praised at every gathering, could no longer walk through town without whispers following her. Her friends distanced themselves, some out of disgust, others out of fear that being seen with her would tarnish their own reputations. At school, her teachers who once praised her poise now looked at her with suspicion, questioning how much of her charm had been an act. Linda suffered too, though she tried to keep her composure. The women she gossiped with at church avoided her now, whispering that a mother who dismissed her daughter's near drowning could not be trusted. The judgment that once lived in her eyes was now reflected back at her from the entire community. For decades she had controlled the narrative, shaping me into the difficult daughter, but now the story she had built collapsed in public view. David felt the blow in his own way. At work, his colleagues muttered behind his back, questioning how a father could remain so silent in the face of such abuse. He tried to shrug it off, burying himself in paperwork, but the weight of humiliation clung to him. His silence had always been his shield, but now that silence was seen for what it was, complicity. He no longer had the comfort of ignorance. He had been exposed as a man who chose convenience over protecting his child. At home, the atmosphere curdled. Emily lashed out in fits of rage, screaming that I had ruined her life. Linda cried in the kitchen, insisting I had destroyed the family's good name. David retreated further into his study, avoiding confrontation, though his slammed doors and heavy sighs betrayed his frustration. None of them admitted fault. They blamed me as always, but the difference now was that no one else believed them. Their words bounced against walls of skepticism instead of sinking into unquestioned acceptance. For me, the consequences were heavy but liberating. I bore the physical pain of lingering headaches, dizziness, and the raw ache of betrayal, but I also carried the weight of survival transformed into strength. At the hospital, nurses who had once doubted me now treated me with gentleness and admiration. One whispered, "You are brave, Sarah. You saved yourself." At the grocery store, strangers approached quietly, saying they had heard about the case, that they admired my courage. For the first time, the community saw me not as dramatic Sarah, but as the woman who had stood up against lies. Emily was ordered to attend mandatory counseling sessions. Linda faced scrutiny from child services, forced to answer uncomfortable questions she had never imagined would be asked. They both resented it, snarling that I had dragged the family name through the mud, but I knew the truth. They had buried themselves. The legal restrictions added to their humiliation. A restraining order prevented them from approaching me, which meant that the control they once wielded so effortlessly was gone. I could walk through town without fearing Linda's hissed accusations or Emily's manipulative taunts. They were confined to their own bitterness, silenced not by my fear, but by the law. The fracture in their image was permanent. Neighbors no longer dropped by for coffee. Friends no longer called for favors. Invitations to community events dwindled until they were non-existent. The Miller family that had once appeared perfect now carried the stain of scandal. Each of them bore it differently. Emily grew restless and reckless, drinking too much at parties, where she was no longer the center of attention. Linda shrank, her once sharp voice faltering into silence when others looked her way. David buried himself in his office, avoiding questions with curt answers. Their downfall was not dramatic in a single blow, but slow, suffocating, a steady erosion of the life they had constructed. And in that erosion, I found justice. I was not naive. I knew they still hated me, that behind closed doors they cursed my name. But hatred could not restore their lost reputation. Their anger could not erase the evidence that had exposed them. They were trapped in the reality they had once tried to trap me in. Meanwhile, I began to breathe freely. The nightmares still came, pulling me back into the lake with icy hands, but each morning I woke with the reminder that I had survived both the water and their lies. I started therapy, learning that my worth was not measured by Linda's cold words or Emily's smug victories. I rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, a life where their shadows no longer defined me. The consequences that tore their world apart became the bricks with which I built my freedom. The greatest shift was in the way people looked at me. No longer the dramatic girl I was, now the woman who had faced her family's cruelty and lived to tell the truth. That truth carried weight. It spread through whispers, through cautious admiration, through the subtle but powerful shift of perception. They had tried to drown me, but now they were the ones drowning in the consequences of their choices. Freedom did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, small moments that began to piece together a new life for me. The first came the morning I woke in my own apartment, sunlight spilling across the floorboards, and realized the silence around me was not hostile. It was not the suffocating silence of Linda's judgment, or Emily's manipulations, or David's avoidance. This silence belonged to me. It carried no accusation, no weight of expectation. It simply existed calm and unthreatening. For the first time in years, I breathed without waiting for someone to cut me down. I filled the apartment with things that were mine alone: a second-hand bookshelf, a quilt I found at a flea market, a plant that leaned toward the light. Each item was a declaration that I no longer lived in their shadow. The nightmares still came, dragging me back into the lake water, filling my lungs. Linda's voice dismissing my struggle, Emily's eyes glinting with triumph. But when I woke, gasping in the dark, I reminded myself that those moments were past. The restraining order protected me. The evidence had spoken. They could no longer reach me. Slowly, the dreams lost their grip, replaced by new ones, where I stood on the shore, unafraid of the water. Therapy became a lifeline. My therapist listened without judgment as I recounted years of silence and cruelty. She reminded me that family is not defined by blood, but by love and loyalty. Her words were balm on wounds I had carried for too long. I began to believe that my worth had never been theirs to define. At the hospital where I returned to work, colleagues treated me differently. They smiled warmly, asked how I was healing, some even whispered that my courage had inspired them. One patient, a frail woman with sad eyes, reached for my hand and said, "You gave me strength to speak about my own pain." I realized then that my story was no longer only mine. It had become a spark for others still trapped in silence. Even strangers offered quiet nods of respect when they recognized me from the courtroom coverage. Each acknowledgement stitched together pieces of me that had been torn apart. Letters began arriving, some from women I had never met, sharing their own stories of abuse and gaslighting. They thanked me for standing up, for showing that evidence could topple even the most convincing lies. I read every letter, tears falling freely, grateful that my survival could be more than pain, it could be purpose. My mother tried once to reach me, sending a letter filled with apologies and excuses. She claimed she had been afraid that she had not known what to do, that she wished she could take it back. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness was not something I owed. Emily never wrote. Her silence was not loyalty anymore, but shame, and I let it stay that way. David avoided me entirely, too cowardly to face the truth. Their absence ached, but it also healed. It was better to live without them than to live shackled by betrayal. I found family in unexpected places. Nurses who had stood by me, the social worker who had believed me, the doctor who had testified with unwavering conviction. They were not bound to me by blood, but they had chosen to stand with me when it mattered. That was family too. I stopped chasing the approval of those who had never loved me and began to honor those who had. One evening, as I walked along the edge of Lake Haven, the same water that had almost ended me, I stopped and stared at its surface. The sun dipped low, painting the ripples gold. My chest tightened with memory, but instead of fear, I felt defiance. I had survived that lake, survived the hands that tried to hold me under, survived the voices that told me I was nothing but dramatic. The scar in my mind was still there, but it was no longer a mark of shame. It was proof that I had lived. I whispered to the water, "You did not take me, and they no longer can." Justice had not restored what was broken. It had not given me the childhood I deserved or the love I longed for, but it had given me freedom, and freedom was enough. My story was not the end of pain, but the beginning of truth. The world now knew what had been hidden, and I was no longer silenced. That was the greatest revenge, greater than punishment or humiliation. My liberation came not from their downfall, though it was satisfying to see, but from reclaiming my voice. I began journaling again, not to record cruelty, but to celebrate resilience. Each page filled with gratitude for the life I was building, for the strength I had discovered, for the people who believed me. My vow was clear. Silence protects only the abuser, but truth, though painful, sets the survivor free. I had lived under their lies for too long, but now I walked unafraid into the light of my own story, and that above all was the justice they could never take away.